Have you ever wondered why the Gospels barely mention Jesus' childhood? Between his miraculous birth and the beginning of his ministry at the age of 30, there is a silence, a blank space, a void that has intrigued us for centuries. But is this silence simply an absence of facts, or an echo of what was left out on purpose? In ancient manuscripts, not recognized by official tradition, strange and fascinating stories emerge. A boy who molded clay birds and gave them life. A young man with impressive authority and attitudes that today would be seen as controversial. Why were these accounts ignored? And more, what do they tell us about the true character of Jesus before the cross, before the public miracles, before being recognized as the Messiah? In this video, we will walk through hidden texts, theological decisions, and the delicate effort to mold a divine image. What is at stake here, perhaps, is not just history, but the very essence of faith. Are you ready to see what you may never have been told? When we open the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find detailed passages about the birth of Jesus, the visit of the Magi, the flight into Egypt, the massacre of the innocents. Powerful accounts full of symbolism and reverence. But after that, silence. From his first steps to adolescence, from his ordinary days with his brothers to his learning of the faith with Mary and Joseph, practically nothing is said. For almost 30 decades, what we know about Jesus' life is almost nothing. Why such an abrupt jump from his early years directly to his baptism in the Jordan as an adult? Could it be because nothing relevant happened during this period? Or was something left out, or perhaps removed? Among all the canonical accounts, there is only one episode recorded: Jesus at the age of 12 in the temple in Jerusalem. The story is brief but remarkable. He gets separated from his parents during the pilgrimage, and when they find him, he's among the doctors of the law, asking questions and giving answers that surprise everyone. Why was this episode preserved and not the others? The choice seems intentional. A young Jesus already demonstrating divine wisdom, respect for the law, and submission to the Father's will. The scene reinforces his messianic identity, but without compromising the image of perfection that the doctrine would later develop. And yet, after this glimpse, everything fades away again. Jesus returns with his parents and, according to the text, was obedient to them. After that, the next event shows him before John the Baptist, beginning his public ministry. This gap raises uncomfortable questions. Did the authors not know what happened at that time? Or did they know, but chose not to record it? The Christian tradition has always treated this absence as a reverent mystery. It is not for us to know what God has not revealed. But for others, this absence is symptomatic. It is the trace of what was suppressed. After all, how can the most influential man in history have 3 entire decades of his life almost entirely ignored by the evangelists themselves? In ancient times, silence was also a form of control. What is not told is not contested. What is not revealed is not discussed. The emptiness of the narrative allows us to shape an image without interference. An adult, mature Messiah, ready to fulfill his mission without traces of childhood, failures, or human learning. But what does this silence hide? perhaps more than the absence of facts, it reveals an intention to protect an idealized image, preserve a mystery, or avoid exposing less convenient aspects of Jesus' youth. This silence, then, is not empty. It speaks, and what it whispers can take us to places that many would prefer not to explore. If the canonical Gospels remain silent about Jesus' childhood, other texts, less known and long marginalized, dare to speak.
These writings are called Apocryphal Gospels, a word that comes from the Greek apokryphos, meaning hidden, concealed. They are not part of the official Bible, but they were read, copied, and respected by Christian communities in the early centuries. Some of them contain exactly what is missing from the canonical texts, accounts of Jesus' childhood. One of the most intriguing is the infancy gospel of Thomas, probably written between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The tone here is quite different from what we are used to. Jesus is described as a powerful but unpredictable boy. In one passage, Jesus molds little birds out of clay and makes them come to life with his breath. In another, a boy irritates him, and Jesus curses him, causing him to fall down dead. The child's parents complain, and Jesus does the same to them. Later, when rebuked by Joseph, the boy Jesus seems to learn, reflect, and gradually become more compassionate. The impact of these stories is profound. Here we see a Jesus who is learning to deal with his power, an uncomfortable concept for traditional theology, which claims that he was already fully divine and perfect from the beginning. Another notable text is the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy, probably compiled from Syrian and Egyptian sources. In it, we find milder but still surprising descriptions, accounts of Jesus' life in Egypt, healing people from a very young age, and even facing serpents and dragons in caves in the desert. These texts, although loaded with legendary elements, reveal something essential. There was a deep desire in the early Christian communities to fill the void of Jesus' childhood. It was not just curiosity, it was a spiritual need, a human Messiah who grew, learned, matured, who went through a process. But why were these writings rejected? In the early centuries, the Church faced the challenge of defining the Christian faith amid dozens of conflicting versions. It was necessary to establish an official narrative, and this included choosing which texts would be considered inspired by God. The Apocrypha was seen as dangerous for several reasons. First, they showed a more human Jesus, sometimes even flawed, learning from his mistakes, something that clashed directly with the image of absolute perfection. Second, these texts did not come from direct apostolic sources. Some seemed to be close to Gnosticism, a movement considered heretical for emphasizing esoteric knowledge over simple faith. And third, these accounts threatened control of the narrative. An unpredictable Christ, a child with ambiguous attitudes, could generate confusion among the faithful. And in a world where Christianity was in the midst of institutional construction, clarity was a powerful weapon. Of course, not all Apocrypha have historical value. Many contain mythological elements, exaggerations, and repetitions. But the fact that they exist, and that they circulated widely for centuries, shows us that the story of Jesus' childhood was much more alive and discussed than we imagine. These texts reveal not only forbidden content, but a portrait of what has been forgotten, ignored, or silenced. They invite us to imagine a Christ in the making, a child with divine gifts and a human heart, a God who perhaps has also learned to be a son. In the councils, in the pulpits, and in official texts, Jesus began to be presented as the perfect God from the beginning, immutable, pure, flawless, without doubts. A Messiah who was born knowing who he was, who never made mistakes, never hesitated, never needed to learn. But what if this image is only part of the story? The Apocryphal Gospels, as we have seen, show a more human side, a Jesus growing up, dealing with emotions, learning to control his gifts, developing his compassion. For many theologians of the time, this was simply unacceptable. Acknowledging that Jesus went through a process, that he learned, matured, and perhaps even made childish mistakes, seemed to threaten his divinity. How could a God make mistakes? How could he grow if he was already perfect? That is why Jesus' childhood was carefully shaped and, in many cases, simply erased. Throughout the history of the Church, it was safer to remain silent. It was easier to teach a Christ who was ready, complete, divine from the cradle, than to explain a Messiah who became who he was through a path of maturation. This construction was not done out of malice, but out of zeal. The leaders of the faith sought to protect the doctrine, maintain unity, avoid theological confusion that could divide communities. But, in doing so, they left aside something profoundly transformative. By hiding Jesus' childhood, they also hid his developing humanity. The one who came into the world to save us may have also gone through the same struggles as we do. The doubts, the impulses, the growth, the maturation. This Jesus, who perhaps fell and got up, who tested limits, who learned to obey, can teach us as much as the Jesus of miracles and the cross. And herein lies the great tension. The more human the image of Christ is, the closer it becomes to us. And, paradoxically, the more divine it also reveals itself, because it shows a God who was not afraid to live life to the fullest. The official image of Jesus, built over the centuries, has fulfilled its role. It has led us to faith, reverence, and salvation. But now, perhaps it is time to look again, to ask with respect and courage, what part of this story has remained in the shadows, and what can we discover by bringing it to light? If the Apocryphal Gospels offer glimpses of Jesus' childhood, it is natural that controversies arise, and with them theories that are as fascinating as they are uncomfortable. The first question that arises is, why do these accounts exist? Were they created to fill a literary void, or are they based on older oral traditions preserved by communities that cherished forgotten memories? There are scholars who argue that some of these texts have real historical roots, even if shrouded in symbolism and mythology. For them, the Apocrypha reveals fragments of a tradition about the child Jesus, perhaps suppressed over time because it did not align with the desired official image. Others see them as mere devotional fantasies, poetic and symbolic attempts to imagine what the childhood of a divine being might have been like, reflecting more the yearnings of the communities that created them than the reality itself. But the most provocative theories go further.
Some say the texts were banned because they revealed a Jesus with supernatural gifts from an early age, and that these powers, used impulsively or defiantly, compromised the doctrine of moral perfection. Would a boy who resurrects classmates, curses teachers, or molds animals out of clay and gives them life be revered or feared? Another theory suggests that the infancy stories were suppressed because they showed a Messiah still in the making, not fully aware of his mission, experiencing human emotions such as frustration, impatience, or even pride. This would be dangerous for the narrative of the Church, which needed a divine and stable Christ from the beginning.
There are also esoteric interpretations, some linked to Gnosticism, that see a coded message in these texts. Jesus as a being who needed to awaken his Christ consciousness throughout his life. A bearer of the divine spark, yes, but who needed to go through trials, challenges, and internal revelations until he became the full Christ. Theories like these divide opinions. For many Christians, they sound like threats, but for others, they open up a fertile field for reflection. What if Jesus really went through a process? Would that make him less divine or closer to us? What if he, like us, had to learn to deal with his own power, with his calling, with his mission? Would that diminish his glory, or would it further magnify his dedication? Many modern theologians are beginning to consider that accepting Jesus' humanity in its fullness does not contradict his divinity. It only completes it. A God who not only became flesh, but who lived the entire human journey, from childhood to the final sacrifice. It is natural that there is resistance, the fear of profaning the sacred, of humanizing the divine too much. But perhaps the real risk is not in asking questions, but in failing to ask. Controversies exist because truth, when it is too big, does not fit into narrow molds. It overflows. And when this happens, all we can do is what Jesus did at the age of 12. Sit among the teachers, listen, ask, and surprise with answers that still echo. In the face of so many centuries of silence, concealment, and mystery, it is fair to ask, why return to these stories now? Why dig into forgotten memories and rejected texts? Because what is at stake here is not just the past, it is the present of our faith, and the way we see Jesus himself. For many, the image of Christ has been constructed as something unattainable, a distant perfection, a model that inspires, but that seems beyond our human reach, a divine being, but so elevated that it bears little resemblance to our daily struggles. But what if rediscovering Jesus' childhood is precisely what helps us connect with him in a more intimate way? Seeing a Jesus who went through the experience of growing up, who had to learn to listen, control, love, brings us closer. It humanizes our faith. It reveals that even the Son of God may have faced stages, doubts, processes. This does not weaken faith. On the contrary, it makes it more real. Furthermore, in a world where many no longer accept ready-made answers, where questioning is part of the spiritual search, exploring these forgotten themes is an invitation to maturity in faith, a faith that is not afraid to ask questions, that understands that reverence is not synonymous with silence, but with respectful courage. It is also important because the way we understand Jesus shapes the way we live. If we see him only as a distant ideal, we may constantly feel inadequate. But if we recognize him as someone who also lived through time, the body, growth, then we are invited to see the beauty of the process in our own lives. Ultimately, it matters because the truth, even if uncomfortable, has the power to set us free. And perhaps, amidst ancient texts and forgotten voices, there is not only a different Jesus, but a more complete Jesus, closer, more alive. Jesus' childhood still matters because it is the mirror of the greatest mystery, a God who not only came to us, but who allowed himself to live like us. For centuries, Jesus' childhood was shrouded in silence. The official Gospels said little. Tradition preferred to forget. The apocryphal texts were rejected, marginalized, hidden. But silence also speaks. It reveals choices, intentions, fears, and perhaps truths that time has not yet managed to erase. Today, as we revisit forgotten stories, as we listen to the voices that echo from the margins of history, we are not denying our faith. We are deepening our gaze. We are saying that Jesus is too great to fit into the pages that have been given to us, that his mystery is not limited to what has been authorized, that his humanity is also sacred. And by imagining a child Jesus with immense gifts and a heart in formation, we are challenged to see the divine not only in ready-made perfection, but also in the process, in growth, in learning, in forgiven mistakes, in the path taken. This image frees us. It heals us. It invites us. It shows us that we are not alone in our imperfections, that God did not stand aloof waiting for us to be worthy. He entered our history. He lived our flesh, and perhaps our childhood as well. As we conclude this journey, the question that remains is not whether all of this is historical truth, but what it reveals about our relationship with Jesus. Are we willing to know him beyond the official image? Do we have the courage to meet him again like someone who meets an old friend, with new eyes? Perhaps what was erased from the past is precisely what can transform our present the most. Now, the decision is yours. You can forget all of this, consider it a passing curiosity, and move on. Or you can choose to look at the silence attentively and ask with faith and courage, what else have they not told me?